They say family is supposed to believe you when no one else will. But what happens when the person tearing your family apart isn't a stranger? It's someone who married into it. Someone who convinced everyone you love that your medical condition is just an elaborate performance for attention. My name is Maya Chen-Rodriguez, and this is the story of how my brother-in-law's wife nearly destroyed my life, my health, and my relationships with the people I trusted most. It's about the moment I realized that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one you can see coming. It's the one sitting at your family dinner table, wearing a smile while planting seeds of doubt about your very sanity. But most importantly, this is about what happened when science finally gave me the proof I needed to reclaim my truth.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
3 months ago, I was living what most people would consider a pretty normal life for a 24-year-old in Portland, Oregon. I had my own apartment in the Pearl District, nothing fancy, but it was mine. I worked as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm downtown, spending my days creating logos for local coffee shops and designing websites for startup companies that may or may not survive their first year. It wasn't glamorous, but I loved the creative freedom and the fact that I could walk to work through the city's tree-lined streets. My family lived scattered across the Pacific Northwest, but we stayed close. My parents, David and Carmen Rodriguez, had retired to a small house in Bend after my dad finished his career as a high school principal and my mom wrapped up 30 years of nursing. My older brother Marcus lived in Seattle with his wife of 2 years, Stephanie Caldwell Rodriguez, where he worked in tech and she practiced as a pediatric nurse practitioner. We were the kind of family that actually enjoyed each other's company. Every other weekend, either I'd drive up to Seattle or Marcus and Stephanie would come down to Portland, and we'd spend Sundays at my parents' place playing board games, hiking the nearby trails, or just catching up over my mom's legendary enchiladas. During holidays, my Aunt Patricia and Uncle Jim would drive up from Sacramento with my cousins, and my dad's sister Elena would fly in from Denver with her twins. We'd pack into my parents' house like sardines, and somehow it never felt crowded, just full of love and laughter. I had what you might call an invisible disability, though I hated that term. Since I was 16, I'd been dealing with what doctors initially called episodes, moments where I'd suddenly feel disconnected from my surroundings, sometimes losing time, occasionally experiencing what looked like small seizures. The neurologist I saw in college, Dr. Amanda Foster, suspected epilepsy, but said the tests were inconclusive. She prescribed anti-seizure medication as a precaution and told me to keep a detailed log of any incidents. The medication helped significantly. I went from having noticeable episodes several times a week to maybe one mild incident every few weeks, and often they were so subtle that only I noticed them. I'd feel a strange sensation like déjà vu mixed with vertigo, or I'd find myself staring off into space for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. To anyone watching, I might just look like someone daydreaming or lost in thought. My family had always been supportive about my condition. When I was first diagnosed, my mom researched epilepsy extensively and made sure everyone understood what to do if I had a more severe episode. My dad installed special lighting in my old bedroom to avoid triggers, and Marcus even downloaded an app to track my medications when I occasionally stayed at his place. But that supportive dynamic began to shift about 6 months ago, right around the time Stephanie started making what seemed like innocent observations. It started small. During a family barbecue at my parents' house in June, I was helping my mom carry dishes from the kitchen when I felt one of my episodes coming on. I recognized the warning signs immediately: a strange metallic taste in my mouth and a feeling like the world was tilting slightly. I quickly set down the plates I was carrying and sat down on the nearest chair, closing my eyes and doing the breathing exercises Dr. Foster had taught me. Oh no. Maya's having one of her spells again, I heard Stephanie say from across the patio. When I opened my eyes a moment later, she was watching me with what looked like concern, but something in her tone felt different. Clinical. Detached. "Are you okay, mija?" asked my mom, immediately coming over to check on me. "Yeah, just a small one. It's passing."
It's so interesting how these episodes always seem to happen when there's a lot of people around, Stephanie commented, ostensibly to Marcus, but loud enough for everyone to hear. I've noticed that pattern. At the time, I brushed off the comment. Stephanie was a healthcare professional after all. Maybe she was just making a clinical observation. But looking back, that was the first crack in what would eventually become a chasm. A few weeks later, during my birthday dinner at a restaurant in Portland, I had another episode while we were waiting for dessert. This time it was more noticeable. I lost about 30 seconds completely, and when I came back to awareness, everyone was staring at me with varying degrees of concern and confusion. "Maybe we should call someone," my dad suggested, reaching for his phone. No, I'm fine," I insisted, though I felt shaky and embarrassed. "This happens sometimes. It's just part of the condition." Stephanie said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "You know, in my experience, working with pediatric patients, attention-seeking behaviors often intensify around significant events like birthdays or family gatherings. The subconscious mind craves being the center of attention." The table fell silent. Marcus looked uncomfortable. My parents exchanged glances, and I felt my cheeks burn with something between embarrassment and anger. "Stephanie," Marcus said quietly, "Maya has epilepsy." "Of course," she said quickly, her voice taking on a more diplomatic tone. "I'm not suggesting anything intentional, just that the mind-body connection is incredibly complex, especially with neurological conditions that can be influenced by stress or emotional factors." I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but what could I say? That I wasn't subconsciously seeking attention? How do you prove a negative? Instead, I excused myself to the bathroom and tried to process what had just happened. Had my sister-in-law really just suggested that my medical condition was psychological? And if so, why? Over the next few months, these kinds of comments became more frequent and more pointed. Stephanie would make observations about the timing of my episodes, question whether I was taking my medication correctly, or share anecdotes from her medical training about patients who had conversion disorders or somatic symptoms. She never accused me directly. She was too smart for that. Instead, she planted seeds of doubt with the surgical precision of someone who understood exactly how to undermine credibility while maintaining plausible deniability. The worst part was watching how her comments began to affect my family. My parents started asking more questions about my medication, my stress levels, my work situation. Marcus began suggesting that maybe I should see a therapist just to have someone to talk to about everything. Even my cousins seemed to treat me differently during family gatherings, like they were walking on eggshells or watching for signs of something. By September, I realized that Stephanie had successfully repositioned my medical condition as a topic of family concern rather than family support. Instead of being the daughter and sister who happened to have epilepsy, I had become the family member whose episodes needed to be managed, questioned, and analyzed. The breaking point came during Labor Day weekend when the entire family gathered at my parents' house for what was supposed to be a celebration of the end of summer. I had been feeling more stressed than usual, work had been particularly demanding, and I could sense the shift in my family's attitude toward me, even if I couldn't quite articulate it yet. During dinner, while my Uncle Jim was telling a story about my cousin's recent promotion, I felt the familiar warning signs of an episode coming on, but this time, instead of the usual brief disconnection, something different happened. The episode was longer and more severe than anything I had experienced in years. When I came back to awareness, I was on the floor of my parents' dining room, surrounded by worried faces and the distant sound of someone on the phone with 911. "Cancel the ambulance," I heard Stephanie's voice say firmly. "She's fine. This is what I was talking about." And in that moment, lying on my parents' hardwood floor, with the taste of blood from where I'd bitten my tongue, I realized that my family's faith in me was slipping away, and I had no idea how to get it back. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The emergency room at Oregon Health and Science University was exactly as sterile and overwhelming as I remembered from my previous visits. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while I sat on the examination table, still feeling disoriented from the episode at dinner. My parents flanked me on either side, while Marcus paced near the window, and Stephanie stood by the door, arms crossed, checking her phone. Dr. Rachel Kim, the attending physician, was reviewing my medical history on her tablet when she looked up with the kind of professional concern that immediately put me at ease. She was probably in her early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the confident demeanor of someone who had seen everything the ER could throw at her. "Maya, your family mentioned this was a more severe episode than usual," she said, pulling up a rolling stool to sit at eye level with me. "Can you walk me through what you remember?" I explained the warning signs, the longer duration, and waking up on the floor. Dr. Kim nodded, making notes, asking follow-up questions about my current medication dosage, stress levels, and whether I'd noticed any changes in the frequency or intensity of my episodes recently. "Well, the good news is that all your vitals are normal now," she said, after completing her examination. "But given that this was more severe than your typical episodes, I'd like to schedule you for some updated testing. When was your last EEG?" "About 3 years ago, in college." "Then it's definitely time for a new one. Brain activity can change over time, especially with epilepsy. We'll also want to do an extended monitoring session, probably 48 to 72 hours, to get a comprehensive picture of what's happening neurologically." That's when Stephanie stepped forward, her voice taking on the polished tone she used when speaking as a medical professional rather than as family. "Doctor, if I may, I'm a pediatric nurse practitioner, and I've been observing Maya's episodes over the past several months. I've noticed some patterns that might be relevant to your assessment." Dr. Kim looked up with interest. "Of course. What have you observed?" "The episodes seem to correlate strongly with social situations where Maya is the center of attention. Family gatherings, birthday celebrations, holidays. They're also more dramatic when there's a larger audience present." Stephanie's voice was clinical, detached. "In my experience with pediatric patients, we sometimes see conversion disorders or functional neurological symptoms that can mimic epilepsy, especially in young adults who may be struggling with family dynamics or life transitions." The room fell silent except for the distant sounds of the emergency department. I felt my face flush hot with humiliation and anger. But before I could respond, Dr. Kim was already shaking her head. "I appreciate your professional perspective," Dr. Kim said carefully, "but Maya has a documented history of seizure activity and has been on anti-seizure medications for years with good results. What we're dealing with tonight appears to be breakthrough seizure activity, which is actually quite common and doesn't suggest a psychological etiology." "Of course," Stephanie said smoothly. "I'm just sharing observations that might help with the differential diagnosis." But the damage was done. I could see it in my parents' faces, a flicker of uncertainty, a moment of doubt that hadn't been there before. Marcus looked uncomfortable, caught between his wife and his sister, while my mom was studying my face as if seeing me for the first time. "I think the extended EEG monitoring will give us the clearest picture," Dr. Kim continued, seemingly unaware of the family drama playing out in front of her. "Maya, I'm going to have the scheduling coordinator set that up for next week. In the meantime, I want you to keep that seizure diary we discussed, and don't hesitate to come back if you have any concerns." The drive home was tense. My parents offered to let me stay at their house for the night, but I declined, wanting nothing more than to be alone in my own apartment. Marcus and Stephanie drove separately, but not before Stephanie gave me what she probably thought was a supportive hug. "I hope you know I'm just looking out for you," she whispered in my ear. "Sometimes we need to consider all possibilities, even uncomfortable ones." Over the next few days, I found myself obsessively researching conversion disorders and functional neurological symptoms online. The more I read, the more disturbed I became. The symptoms could indeed mimic epilepsy. Patients often had normal EEGs. The condition was sometimes triggered by stress, trauma, or psychological factors. And most troubling of all, many patients genuinely believed they were having real seizures. Was Stephanie right? Had I somehow convinced myself that my episodes were medical when they were actually psychological? But that didn't make sense. I'd been having these episodes since I was 16, long before any significant life stressors or family drama. And my medication had clearly helped reduce their frequency. The doubt began eating away at me in ways I hadn't expected. I started second-guessing every episode, wondering if other people could tell the difference between a real seizure and a fake one. I became hyper-aware of when episodes occurred, noting with growing paranoia that they did seem to happen more often when I was around family or in social situations. But then I realized something important. Of course my episodes were more noticeable in social situations. That's when I was around other people who could witness them. The episodes that happened when I was alone, at home, or at work, and there were plenty of those, simply went unobserved and unremarked upon. My work began to suffer as I became increasingly anxious about having an episode in front of my colleagues. I started declining invitations to team lunches and client meetings, claiming I was too busy with projects. My boss, Jennifer Walsh, noticed the change in my behavior and asked if everything was okay, but I couldn't find the words to explain what was happening without sounding either crazy or defensive. The worst part was how my family dynamics continued to deteriorate. During our regular Sunday dinners, conversations would halt whenever I entered a room, as if I had interrupted a discussion about me. My mom started asking probing questions about my stress levels, my work satisfaction, whether I was happy living alone. My dad began suggesting I consider moving back home, just temporarily, until you get your health sorted out. Marcus tried to maintain neutrality, but I could see him watching me during family gatherings, his expression a mixture of concern and something that looked uncomfortably like pity. He'd always been protective of me as my older brother, but now his protectiveness felt conditional, as if he was protecting me from myself rather than from outside threats. The breaking point came during a phone call with my mom 3 days before my scheduled EEG monitoring. She'd called to check in, as she did every few days, but this conversation was different. Mija, I've been thinking about what Stephanie said at the hospital, about how stress can sometimes manifest in physical symptoms. Maybe you should consider talking to someone, a therapist or counselor, while you're waiting for these test results. Mom, I've had epilepsy for 8 years. This isn't new and it's not psychological. I know, but Stephanie knows about these things and she's worried about you. We all are. Maybe there are some underlying issues that could be making your condition worse. What kind of underlying issues? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Well, you've been living alone for 2 years now, working at that stressful job, and you haven't had a serious relationship in a while. Sometimes when young people are struggling with independence or feeling isolated, their bodies can react in unexpected ways. I hung up the phone feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. My own mother, the woman who had researched my condition, who had held my hand through doctor's appointments, who had always been my fiercest advocate, was now questioning whether my medical condition was real. That night, I sat in my apartment looking out at the Portland skyline and made a decision that would change everything. I pulled out my laptop and began documenting every episode I could remember from the past 6 months, noting the date, time, location, who was present, what I was doing beforehand, and how severe the episode was. I also started recording myself during times when I was alone, hoping to capture an episode on video to prove to myself and my family that these incidents were real, consistent, and definitely not performative. But more importantly, I realized that the upcoming EEG monitoring wasn't just about my medical care anymore. It had become something much more fundamental. My credibility, my relationship with my family, and my own sense of reality. The test results wouldn't just determine my treatment plan. They would determine whether the people I loved most in the world would continue to believe me or continue to doubt me. As I prepared for what felt like the most important medical test of my life,
I had no idea that Stephanie's campaign against my credibility was just getting started, and that the real battle for my family's faith in me was still to come. What I did know was that I was no longer just fighting epilepsy, I was fighting for the right to be believed.
The neurological monitoring unit at OHSU was nothing like I had imagined. Instead of the cold, clinical environment I expected, it resembled a hotel room more than a hospital ward. The walls were painted in soothing earth tones, there was a comfortable reclining chair by the window, and even a small kitchenette where family members could prepare simple meals during extended stays. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the epileptologist who would be overseeing my 72-hour monitoring session, was a sharp-featured woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and an intensity that commanded immediate respect. She had reviewed my medical history and seemed genuinely puzzled by the gap between my documented seizure activity and my family's recent concerns. "Maya, I want to be completely transparent about what we're doing here and why," she said as the EEG technician, a soft-spoken man named David, began attaching the electrodes to my scalp. "Based on your medication response over the past 8 years and your previous test results, I have no reason to doubt that you have epilepsy. However, given the increased severity of your recent episodes and some questions that have been raised about their nature, we need comprehensive data." The electrode placement process took nearly an hour. David carefully measured positions on my scalp, applied conductive gel, and secured each electrode with medical tape and gauze. By the end, I looked like I was wearing a bizarre technological helmet, with dozens of colorful wires snaking from my head to a portable monitoring device that would record my brain activity continuously. "The goal is to capture your normal brain activity, any seizure activity, and everything in between," Dr. Martinez explained. "We'll also be video monitoring you 24/7 so we can correlate any physical symptoms with the electrical activity in your brain. If you have an episode during this monitoring period, we'll have definitive proof of what's happening neurologically." What she didn't say, but what we both understood, was that if I didn't have any episodes, or if the episodes weren't accompanied by abnormal brain activity, it would support Stephanie's theory that my condition was psychological rather than neurological. The first day of monitoring was surreal. I had brought books, my laptop, and downloaded several seasons of shows to keep myself occupied, but I found it nearly impossible to concentrate on anything. Every few minutes, I became conscious of the electrodes on my scalp and the fact that my brain activity was being recorded in real time. It felt like being under a microscope, which only increased my anxiety about having an episode. My parents visited that evening, bringing my favorite Thai takeout and an awkward mixture of concern and skepticism that I was beginning to recognize as their new default attitude toward me. My mom fussed over whether I was comfortable, whether the electrodes were too tight, whether I needed anything from home, but underneath her maternal caring, I could sense her watching me for signs of distress or unusual behavior. "How do you feel about all this testing me, huh? Are you nervous?" "A little. I just want to get some answers." "What if the tests show that there's nothing wrong neurologically? Would you be open to exploring other explanations?" The question hit me like a physical blow. My own mother was essentially asking if I would accept that my 8-year medical history was based on a delusion. "Mom, what if the tests confirm that I do have epilepsy, just like every doctor who's ever treated me has said? Will you finally stop listening to Stephanie's theories and start believing your own daughter again?" My mom looked stricken. "Maya, of course I believe you. I'm just trying to keep an open mind about all possibilities." But that was exactly the problem. By keeping an open mind about whether my medical condition was real, she had closed her mind to the possibility that Stephanie might be wrong, manipulative, or acting out of motives that had nothing to do with medical knowledge or family concern. The second day brought a different kind of visitor. Marcus arrived alone, explaining that Stephanie was working a double shift at the children's hospital. I was grateful for her absence. I needed to talk to my brother without his wife's clinical observations coloring every word. "Maya, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me," Marcus said after settling into the visitor's chair. "Have you ever wondered if there might be some truth to what Stephanie has been saying? Are you seriously asking me if I think I've been faking seizures for 8 years? I replied, incredulous. Not faking, he said quickly, but maybe, I don't know, maybe there are psychological factors that you haven't considered. Maybe the stress of adult life, living alone, work pressure. Maybe it's manifesting in ways that feel like your old seizures but are actually something different. I stared at my brother, the person who had been my closest ally my entire life, who had defended me against playground bullies and high school mean girls, who had celebrated every achievement and supported me through every challenge. Now he was sitting in my hospital room, suggesting that my medical condition might be all in my head.
Marcus, do you remember when I had my first seizure? I asked. I was 16, junior year of high school. I was in AP history class taking a test on World War II. There was no stress, no drama, no reason for psychological symptoms. I just suddenly felt strange, and the next thing I knew, I was on the floor and Mr. Peterson was calling 911. I remember, he said quietly. And do you remember all the neurologist appointments, the medication trials, the times I had to miss family events because the side effects made me too sick to function? Do you remember how relieved we all were when Dr. Foster found a medication that worked? Marcus nodded, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. I remember all of that. But Stephanie says that sometimes psychological conditions can start with real medical triggers, and then the mind continues producing symptoms even after the original cause is resolved. Stephanie says, I repeated angrily. When did Stephanie become more of an expert on my medical history than the neurologists who've been treating me for 8 years? When did her opinions become more valuable than my lived experience? She's not trying to hurt you, Maya. She's a healthcare professional who's concerned about you. We all are. No, Marcus, you're concerned about me. Stephanie is concerned about being right, and there's a big difference. That night, alone, with the constant hum of the monitoring equipment, I began to understand the true scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about medical diagnoses anymore. Stephanie had successfully repositioned herself as the family's medical authority, despite never having treated neurological conditions and never having examined me professionally. She had used her credentials and her position as Marcus's wife to gradually erode my family's trust in my own experience of my body and mind. More disturbingly, she had done it so gradually and systematically that my family genuinely believed they were being supportive and open-minded. They couldn't see that by questioning my credibility about my own medical condition, they were actually participating in a form of gaslighting that was damaging not just our relationships, but my mental health and potentially my physical safety. The third day brought the episode I had been both hoping for and dreading. I was eating lunch and watching a cooking show when I felt the familiar metallic taste that preceded my seizures. But this time, instead of the fear and confusion I usually experienced, I felt a strange sense of relief. Finally, I would have proof. The episode was moderate in severity. I lost consciousness for about 2 minutes and experienced some confusion afterward, but I didn't fall or injure myself. When I came back to awareness, David, the technician, was already reviewing the data on his computer screen, while Dr. Martinez studied the real-time readout with intense concentration. Maya, how do you feel? Dr. Martinez asked, her voice carefully neutral. Tired, a little confused, but okay. Did you get what you needed? She didn't answer immediately, instead continuing to study the data. Finally, she looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. We definitely recorded some interesting activity, but I want to review all 72 hours of data before we discuss the results. We should have a comprehensive report ready by early next week. The waiting period between the end of monitoring and receiving the results was torture. I returned to my apartment feeling like I was in limbo, neither vindicated nor condemned, but suspended in uncertainty.
I took a few days off work, claiming I needed to recover from the monitoring process, but really I just couldn't face the possibility of having an episode in front of my colleagues while my own family doubted my condition. During this time, Stephanie ramped up her campaign in ways that were both subtle and devastating. She began sharing articles in our family group chat about conversion disorders, functional neurological symptoms, and the epidemic of misdiagnosed psychological conditions masquerading as physical illnesses. She always framed these shares as educational or interesting, never directly connecting them to my situation, but the implication was clear. She also began scheduling more frequent visits with my parents, ostensibly to help them understand complex neurological conditions and how families can best support loved ones with ambiguous symptoms. I wasn't invited to these visits, but I heard about them secondhand from my mom, who would call afterward with new questions about my stress levels, my social life, and whether I had considered counseling. The most insidious part of Stephanie's strategy was how she had managed to make my family believe that questioning my medical condition was actually a form of love and support. She had convinced them that by refusing to enable what she suggested might be attention-seeking behavior, they were helping me confront difficult truths about my mental health. As I sat in my apartment waiting for test results that would either validate 8 years of my medical history or potentially destroy my relationship with my family, I realized that I was facing something much larger than a medical diagnosis. I was confronting the power of systematic doubt to undermine not just how others see you, but how you see yourself. The phone call from Dr. Martinez's office couldn't come soon enough.
The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was attempting to work from home, though work was a generous term for staring blankly at my computer screen and refreshing my email every 30 seconds. Dr. Martinez's voice was crisp and professional when I answered, but I detected something underneath. Excitement, maybe, or vindication. Maya, I'd like you to come in this afternoon to discuss your test results. Can you be here at 2 p.m.? And I'd recommend bringing any family members who've been involved in your care decisions. My heart hammered against my ribs. The fact that she wanted family present could mean anything. Good news that required support or bad news that would need careful explanation. I called my parents and Marcus, explaining that Dr. Martinez wanted to meet with all of us. Within minutes, my phone was buzzing with questions I couldn't answer. The most challenging call was to Marcus. "Should Stephanie come?" he asked immediately. "She's been really invested in understanding your condition, and her medical background might help us ask the right questions." I took a deep breath, realizing this was my moment to draw a line in the sand. "Marcus, I need you to hear me on this. Stephanie is not my doctor. She's not treating my condition, and she's not objective about my medical care. This meeting is about my health, not about proving or disproving her theories. I need you there as my brother, not as her representative." There was a long pause. "Maya, that's not fair. She's family too, and she's been trying to help." "Help who?" I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, she's been systematically undermining my credibility for months. If she wants to help, she can start by stepping back and letting my actual doctors handle my medical care. "I think you're being paranoid," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then prove me wrong. Come to this appointment as my brother, not as Stephanie's husband. If the results support what she's been saying, you can tell her about it afterward. But this conversation needs to be about me and my health, not about her being right." To his credit, Marcus agreed, though I could hear the reluctance in his voice. My parents offered to pick me up, but I declined, needing the drive to Dr. Martinez's office to prepare myself mentally for whatever was coming. The waiting room in the neurology department was nearly empty when I arrived. My parents were already there, sitting close together and speaking in hushed tones that stopped when they saw me. Marcus arrived a few minutes later, alone, which I took as a small victory. Dr. Martinez called us back to her office rather than an examination room, which felt significant. Her desk was organized with military precision, and she had several printouts and what looked like brain scan images arranged in front of her. She gestured for us to sit in the chairs arranged in a semicircle facing her desk. "I want to start by thanking you all for being here," she began, looking directly at me. "Maya, these results are going to change how we manage your condition going forward, and having family support will be important." My mom reached over and squeezed my hand. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together," she said, though I noticed she couldn't quite meet my eyes. Dr. Martinez opened the first folder and pulled out what looked like a printout of brainwave patterns, jagged lines moving across grid paper like seismograph readings. "Let me start with the most important finding. Maya, during your 72-hour monitoring period, we recorded clear, unambiguous seizure activity that correlates perfectly with your reported episode on day 3. She pointed to a section of the printout where the normally regular wave patterns suddenly became chaotic and erratic. "This is classic temporal lobe epilepsy activity. The electrical storm in your brain during this episode was significant and completely consistent with the type of seizure disorder you've been treated for since you were 16. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I wasn't sure if they were from relief or vindication or simply exhaustion from months of having my reality questioned. "Furthermore," Dr. Martinez continued, "we found evidence of subclinical seizure activity, electrical abnormalities that don't produce visible symptoms but indicate ongoing neurological instability. This explains why your episodes may have seemed to increase in frequency recently. Your brain has been working harder to control seizure activity, and occasionally it's breaking through despite your medication." My father cleared his throat. "Doctor, we've had some concerns raised about whether Maya's episodes might be psychological in nature, stress-related, or attention-seeking behavior." Dr. Martinez's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Rodriguez, I want to be very clear about something. What we documented during Maya's monitoring is objective, measurable brain activity that cannot be faked, manipulated, or produced by psychological factors. Seizures show distinct electrical patterns that are as unique as fingerprints. What your daughter experienced during monitoring was a genuine neurological event, not a psychological episode." She pulled out another set of images, brain scans that looked like colorful cross-sections of my skull. "Additionally, these MRI images show some subtle changes in Maya's temporal lobe structure that are consistent with long-term epilepsy. These are microscopic scarring patterns that develop over time in people with seizure disorders. They're not dramatic enough to cause concern about brain damage, but they provide additional evidence that Maya has been dealing with genuine neurological activity for years."
Marcus leaned forward, studying the images. "So there's no possibility that this could be conversion disorder or functional symptoms?" "None," Dr. Martinez said firmly. "Conversion disorders don't produce the kind of electrical activity we recorded. They don't cause structural brain changes, and they certainly don't respond to anti-seizure medications the way Maya's condition has responded over the years." She turned back to me. "Maya, I owe you an apology. Based on your medication response and previous test results, I should never have entertained the possibility that your condition was anything other than epilepsy. The fact that questions were raised about the legitimacy of your seizures was inappropriate and potentially harmful to your medical care." The room fell silent, except for the distant sounds of the hospital corridor. I looked at my family, my parents sitting with expressions of shock and what might have been guilt. Marcus staring at the brain scans as if they might rearrange themselves into a different diagnosis. "There's more we need to discuss about your treatment going forward," Dr. Martinez continued. "The EEG showed that your current medication isn't providing optimal seizure control. We're going to need to adjust your dosage and possibly add a second medication. I also want to discuss some lifestyle modifications that might help reduce your seizure frequency." As she outlined the treatment plan, I found myself thinking not about medication adjustments or lifestyle changes, but about what this moment meant for my family relationships. For months, Stephanie had convinced everyone that loving me meant questioning my medical reality. She had positioned herself as the voice of reason, while painting me as either delusional or manipulative. Now, we had scientific proof that I had been telling the truth all along, but I wasn't sure proof was enough to undo the damage that had been done to our family dynamics. After Dr. Martinez finished explaining the treatment plan and we had scheduled follow-up appointments, my family and I walked to the parking garage in uncomfortable silence. Finally, my mom spoke. "Maya, I'm so sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I should never have doubted you. I should have trusted you instead of listening to—" She stopped herself, but we all knew what she had been about to say. "We all should have," my dad added quietly. "You're our daughter. We should have believed you." Marcus was the last to speak. "Maya, I need to apologize too. And I need to talk to Stephanie about how she's been approaching your medical situation. This isn't okay." But even as my family offered their apologies, I realized that having proof of my condition was only the beginning of a much larger challenge. Stephanie had spent months systematically undermining my credibility, not just about my medical condition, but about my judgment, my honesty, and my mental stability. She had positioned herself as the family's medical authority and had used that position to isolate me from the people who were supposed to support me unconditionally. The EEG results proved that my seizures were real, but they didn't address the deeper question of why Stephanie had been so determined to prove they weren't. They didn't explain her motives or prevent her from finding new ways to undermine my credibility. And they didn't automatically restore the trust and easy relationships that had been damaged over the past several months. As I drove home from the appointment, I realized that getting my family to believe my medical diagnosis was just the first step in a longer journey. Now I needed to help them understand how their willingness to doubt me had affected not just my health care, but my sense of security within my own family. More importantly, I needed to figure out how to protect myself from future attacks on my credibility, because I was beginning to suspect that Stephanie's campaign against me wasn't really about medical accuracy at all. It was about something much more personal and much more dangerous. The proof was in my hands, but the real battle was just beginning. The aftermath of the test results should have been a celebration, but instead it felt like navigating a minefield. Armed with Dr. Martinez's definitive diagnosis, I thought my family would immediately rally around me and that Stephanie would gracefully accept that she had been wrong. Instead, what followed was a series of conversations that taught me uncomfortable truths about family loyalty, medical gaslighting, and the psychology of people who refuse to admit they've made devastating mistakes. The first challenge came just 2 days after the appointment, during what was supposed to be a reconciliatory family dinner at my parents' house. Marcus had assured me that he'd spoken with Stephanie about the test results and that she understood she had been wrong about my condition. When I arrived, however, I found her sitting at the kitchen counter with my mom, both of them deep in conversation over a medical journal article Stephanie had printed out. "Maya," Stephanie exclaimed when she saw me, her voice bright with the kind of enthusiasm that immediately put me on guard. "I'm so glad you're here. I've been doing some research on temporal lobe epilepsy, and I found some fascinating information about how stress and psychological factors can still play a role in seizure management, even with confirmed neurological conditions." My mom looked up from the article with renewed interest. Stephanie was just explaining how even with epilepsy, emotional stress can trigger breakthrough seizures. She thinks maybe we should still consider counseling as part of your treatment plan. I felt my stomach drop. Less than 48 hours after receiving definitive proof that my condition was neurological, Stephanie had already found a way to reintroduce psychological factors into the conversation. She wasn't admitting she had been wrong. She was pivoting her argument to maintain her position as the family's medical authority. Stephanie, I said carefully, Dr. Martinez didn't mention anything about psychological factors contributing to my seizures. She focused entirely on medication adjustment and avoiding physical triggers like sleep deprivation and flashing lights. Of course, Stephanie replied smoothly, but neurologists often focus on the pharmaceutical approach. As a nurse practitioner, I'm trained to look at the whole person, physical, emotional, and psychological health. The research shows that even confirmed epilepsy patients benefit from stress management and counseling. She slid the article across the counter to me. It was titled, Psychosocial Factors in Epilepsy Management, a Comprehensive Approach to Patient Care. The abstract discussed how emotional stress could influence seizure frequency in diagnosed epilepsy patients and recommended integrated treatment approaches that included psychological support. The article wasn't wrong exactly, but Stephanie was using it to accomplish something insidious. Instead of acknowledging that she had spent months suggesting my seizures weren't real, she was repositioning herself as someone who had always been concerned about comprehensive care. She was rewriting history to make it seem like her previous comments had been about holistic treatment, rather than questioning my diagnosis. This is really interesting, my mom said, clearly impressed by Stephanie's continued research into my condition. Maya, what do you think about adding some counseling to help manage stress? I realized I was facing a sophisticated manipulation tactic. Stephanie had used the test results not as evidence that she had been wrong, but as an opportunity to establish herself as an expert on my newly confirmed condition. By immediately diving into research and presenting additional treatment recommendations, she was maintaining her position as the family's medical consultant while avoiding any accountability for the damage she had caused. I think I'd like to follow Dr. Martinez's treatment recommendations for now, I said firmly. If she thinks counseling would be beneficial, I'm sure she'll mention it during our follow-up appointments. Of course, Stephanie said, her tone understanding but slightly condescending. I just want to make sure you're getting the most comprehensive care possible. Sometimes specialists can be very focused on their particular area of expertise. Marcus walked into the kitchen at that moment, immediately sensing the tension. What's going on? He asked. Stephanie was just sharing some research about epilepsy treatment. She's been working so hard to understand Maya's condition. I looked at Marcus, hoping he would recognize what was happening, but instead I saw him smile appreciatively at his wife. That's exactly what I love about you, always looking out for family. That's when I understood my second major challenge. My family genuinely believed that Stephanie's continued involvement in my medical care was evidence of her dedication and love, rather than evidence of her inability to admit she had been wrong. They couldn't see that her immediate pivot to new research was a way of avoiding accountability for months of suggesting my seizures weren't real.
The dinner conversation continued with Stephanie sharing additional articles she had found about epilepsy triggers, dietary modifications, and alternative treatment approaches. My parents listened with rapt attention, asking thoughtful questions and thanking her for her thoroughness. Marcus beamed with pride at his wife's dedication to helping his sister. I sat there picking at my food, realizing that the test results had solved the question of my medical diagnosis but had created a new problem. Stephanie had successfully repositioned herself as my advocate and treatment consultant, despite having spent months undermining my credibility. Worse, my family was encouraging this dynamic because they interpreted her research as evidence that she cared about me. The next few weeks brought a series of similar interactions that taught me how sophisticated medical gaslighting could be. Stephanie began sending me articles and research papers about epilepsy management, always framed as, "Thought this might interest you," or "Saw this and remembered our conversation." She started asking detailed questions about my medication side effects, my sleep patterns, and my stress levels. Not in a confrontational way, but with the clinical curiosity of a healthcare provider monitoring a patient. She also began attending family gatherings with a notebook, ostensibly to keep track of my episodes and potential triggers.
When I objected, my mom gently suggested that having someone with medical training observe my condition might be helpful for future doctor's appointments. The fact that this someone with medical training had recently spent months trying to convince everyone that my condition was fake seemed to have been forgotten by everyone except me. The most challenging lesson came during a conversation with my Aunt Patricia, who called to check on me after hearing about the test results from my mom. Patricia had always been one of my favorite relatives, a no-nonsense high school teacher who prided herself on seeing through people's bullshit. I expected her to be outraged that Stephanie had questioned my medical condition. Instead, she surprised me with a different perspective. "Maya, I'm so glad you finally have definitive answers," she said, "and I have to say, I'm impressed with how much research Stephanie has been doing to understand your condition. It shows how much she cares about you." "Aunt Patricia," I said carefully, "you know that Stephanie spent months suggesting that my seizures weren't real, right? That she convinced everyone in the family to doubt my medical condition?" There was a pause. "Well, yes, but I think she was just trying to make sure all possibilities were considered. Sometimes healthcare providers have to ask difficult questions to get to the right diagnosis. And look how dedicated she's been to learning about epilepsy once the diagnosis was confirmed." I realized that my family had unconsciously rewritten the narrative of the past several months. In their version of events, Stephanie hadn't undermined my credibility. She had been conducting a thorough differential diagnosis. Her suggestions about conversion disorders weren't attacks on my honesty. They were examples of comprehensive medical thinking. Her current research wasn't damage control. It was evidence of her commitment to my health. This reframing allowed my family to avoid confronting the uncomfortable truth that they had doubted me based on the manipulative suggestions of someone who had no expertise in neurological conditions. It let them maintain their positive view of Stephanie while avoiding the guilt of acknowledging how their doubt had affected me. But perhaps the most important lesson came from an unexpected source. My coworker Jennifer, who had noticed my distraction over the past few months and finally asked what was going on. When I explained the situation, she listened without interrupting, then offered a perspective that changed how I understood what had happened. "Maya, what you're describing isn't just family drama. It's a pattern of behavior that's actually really common in workplaces and families. There are people who establish themselves as authorities on topics they don't actually understand, and they do it by undermining other people's credibility. The goal isn't to be right about the medical diagnosis. The goal is to be seen as the most knowledgeable, most caring, most indispensable person in the group." Jennifer's observation helped me realize that my conflict with Stephanie wasn't really about epilepsy or medical diagnosis. It was about power dynamics and family positioning. Stephanie had used her medical credentials and her status as the newest family member to establish herself as an authority figure, and questioning my medical condition had been her way of demonstrating her expertise and importance. The test results proving my epilepsy hadn't eliminated this dynamic. They had simply forced Stephanie to find new ways to maintain her position as the family medical consultant. As long as my family continued to view her involvement as helpful rather than harmful, I would continue to face challenges to my autonomy and credibility. Understanding this pattern was both liberating and terrifying. It meant that the problem was bigger than I realized, but it also meant that I could start developing strategies to protect myself from future manipulation. The call came at 7:43 a.m. on a Thursday morning, jolting me awake from the deepest sleep I'd had in weeks. My mom's voice was strained, almost panicked, in a way I hadn't heard since my dad's heart scare 3 years earlier. "Maya, honey, we need to talk. Can you come over this morning before work? Mom, what's wrong? Is Dad okay? Your father's fine. It's about your medical situation. Stephanie found something last night, and we need to discuss it as a family. My blood ran cold. What kind of something? Just come over, mija. We'll explain everything when you get here. The drive to my parents' house felt like traveling through molasses. Every red light stretched into eternity. Every turn revealed new possibilities for a catastrophe. What could Stephanie have possibly found that required an emergency family meeting? The EEG results have been definitive, the brain scans clear, Dr. Martinez's explanation thorough and unambiguous. When I arrived, I found the entire family assembled in the living room like a tribunal. My parents sat on the couch, Marcus in the armchair, and Stephanie standing by the fireplace with her laptop open on the mantel and a stack of printed papers in her hands. The atmosphere was heavy with the kind of tension that precedes life-changing conversations. "Maya, sit down," my dad said gently, patting the cushion beside him. Stephanie cleared her throat, her expression grave, but tinged with something that looked uncomfortably like vindication. "Maya, I want you to know that I've been doing this research because I care about you, not because I want to be right. But last night, I found something that I think changes our understanding of your situation significantly." She turned her laptop screen toward the room, displaying what appeared to be a medical journal article. This is a recent study from Johns Hopkins about a condition called PNES, psychogenic non-epileptic seizures. The key finding is that PNES can occur even in patients who also have genuine epilepsy. It's called comorbid PNES, and it's more common than most people realize. My blood ran cold. "Stephanie, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that it's possible, even likely, that you have both conditions, real epilepsy that shows up on EEGs and psychological seizures that don't. The study shows that patients with comorbid PNES often have breakthrough episodes that correlate with stress, social situations, and emotional triggers, even when their medication is controlling their neurological seizures." She handed me the printed article, her finger pointing to highlighted sections. "Look at this patient profile, a 23-year-old woman with confirmed temporal lobe epilepsy who was still having frequent episodes despite optimal medication management. When they did extended psychological evaluation, they discovered that about 60% of her seizures were actually PNES triggered by family stress and social anxiety." Marcus leaned forward, studying the article over my shoulder. "This explains why your episodes seem to happen more often during family gatherings, even after your medication was adjusted. It also explains why some of your episodes look slightly different from others," my mom added, and I could hear the relief in her voice at having an explanation that reconciled the EEG results with Stephanie's observations. I read through the article with growing horror. The research was legitimate, published in a prestigious journal, and the findings were exactly as Stephanie described. Patients could indeed have both neurological and psychological seizures, and distinguishing between them required sophisticated testing that went beyond standard EEG monitoring. The study recommends video EEG monitoring specifically designed to capture PNES episodes, combined with psychological evaluation and stress testing. "Maya, I think you need to ask Dr. Martinez about this possibility." My dad reached over and squeezed my hand. "Honey, this doesn't change anything about how much we love you or support you, but if there's a psychological component to some of your seizures, addressing it could help reduce their frequency significantly." I stared at the article, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath me again. Just when I thought I had solid proof of my condition, just when my family had apologized for doubting me, Stephanie had found a way to reintroduce the question of psychological factors. But this time, she had done it in a way that didn't contradict the EEG results or challenge Dr. Martinez's expertise. "I need to think about this," I said quietly, standing up from the couch. Of course, Stephanie said, her voice gentle and understanding. But Maya, I want you to know that finding this research felt like a breakthrough to me. It means we can finally address all aspects of your condition instead of just treating it as purely neurological. The drive home was a blur of confusion and self-doubt. Had I been too quick to dismiss the possibility of psychological factors? Was it possible that some of my episodes were indeed triggered by stress or emotional issues, even if others were neurological? The research Stephanie had found was compelling, and like her previous theories, this one didn't require dismissing my EEG results or Dr. Martinez's diagnosis. That afternoon, I called Dr. Martinez's office and asked to speak with her about the PNES research. Her nurse scheduled an appointment for the following week, but warned me that Dr. Martinez's initial reaction was skeptical when she briefly reviewed the article I'd emailed her. Dr. Martinez asked me to tell you that comorbid PNES is quite rare, and the symptoms you've described don't fit the typical profile, but she's happy to discuss it with you in person.
The weekend brought a family dinner that felt like a continuation of Thursday's tribunal. Stephanie had prepared additional research on PENS treatment, including information about specialized clinics that offered combined neurological and psychological approaches to seizure management. She had also found patient testimonials from people who had been successfully treated for comorbid conditions. "Look at this story," she said, showing me a blog post from a woman named Sarah who described having both epilepsy and PENS. She says that once she addressed the psychological component, her overall seizure frequency dropped by 70%. Maya, imagine if you could have that kind of improvement in your quality of life. My family listened with fascination as Stephanie outlined treatment possibilities, potential outcomes, and specialized testing procedures. They asked thoughtful questions about the psychological evaluation process, the effectiveness of therapy for PENS, and whether insurance would cover comprehensive testing. I sat there feeling increasingly isolated, despite being surrounded by people who claimed to be trying to help me. Once again, a family gathering had become a forum for analyzing my medical condition, with Stephanie serving as the expert presenter and my relatives as an engaged audience. Once again, I was the subject of discussion rather than an active participant in decisions about my own healthcare. "Maya, you've been pretty quiet," Marcus observed. "What do you think about all this?" "I think I want to talk to Dr. Martinez before making any decisions about additional testing or treatment changes," I said carefully. "Of course," Stephanie said quickly, "but I hope you'll keep an open mind. Sometimes the most effective treatment approaches are the ones that address multiple factors simultaneously." That night, I lay in bed questioning everything I thought I had learned about my condition and my family dynamics. The PNS research was legitimate, and the possibility of comorbid conditions was medically sound. Maybe Stephanie really was trying to help me, and maybe I was being paranoid or defensive about psychological factors because of my own biases. But then I remembered something Jennifer had said about people who establish themselves as authorities by undermining others' credibility. Even if the PENS research was accurate, Stephanie's persistence in finding psychological explanations for my seizures felt like a pattern rather than genuine medical curiosity. The breaking point came during a phone conversation with my cousin Lisa, who called to check on me after hearing about the PENS research from my Aunt Patricia. Lisa was a social worker who specialized in family therapy, and her perspective on the situation was eye-opening. "Maya, can I ask you something?" she said after I'd explained the latest developments. "Has anyone in your family asked how you feel about having your medical condition constantly analyzed and discussed? Has anyone considered the psychological impact of spending months having your credibility questioned, even if it turns out there are psychological factors involved?" I realized that in all the family meetings, research presentations, and medical discussions, no one had asked about the emotional toll of being doubted, analyzed, and treated like a medical mystery to be solved. No one had considered that the stress of having my condition constantly questioned might actually be contributing to any psychological factors that existed. "Lisa, what if Stephanie is right about the PENS? What if I do have both conditions?" "Then you have both conditions," Lisa said simply. "But that doesn't mean the way this has been handled was appropriate or helpful. Maya, you've spent months being gaslighted about your medical reality. That's traumatic, regardless of what your final diagnosis turns out to be." For the first time since this whole ordeal began,
Someone had acknowledged the psychological impact of medical gaslighting itself. Whether or not I had PENS, the experience of having my credibility systematically undermined had been harmful to my mental health and my relationships with my family. I hung up the phone feeling more confused than ever, but also strangely relieved. Maybe the question wasn't whether Stephanie was right or wrong about psychological factors. Maybe the question was whether her approach to my medical care was helpful or harmful, regardless of the accuracy of her theories. As I prepared for my appointment with Dr. Martinez, I realized I wasn't just seeking medical clarification anymore. I was seeking permission to trust my own experience and to set boundaries around who got to have opinions about my healthcare. The stakes had shifted again, and I wasn't sure I had the energy to keep fighting for the right to be believed.
Dr. Martinez's office felt different this time, less like a medical consultation and more like a sanctuary. I arrived early for my appointment, clutching the PNES research Stephanie had compiled and a list of questions I'd written at 3 a.m. when sleep seemed impossible. The nurse, recognizing me from previous visits, offered a knowing smile that suggested she'd seen patients in similar states of medical confusion before. When Dr. Martinez entered the room, she was carrying a thick folder and wore an expression that I couldn't quite read. Part concern, part determination, and something that might have been anger. Maya, before we discuss the PNES research your family sent over, I need to share something with you, she began, settling into her chair with the deliberate movements of someone preparing for a difficult conversation. I've been practicing neurology for 15 years, and I've seen this pattern before. What's happening to you isn't just about medical diagnosis. It's about psychological manipulation disguised as medical concern. My heart started racing. Dr. Martinez, I don't understand. She opened the folder and pulled out several documents, my original EEG results, brain scans, medication response charts, and what appeared to be additional research papers. Maya, the PNES theory your sister-in-law is proposing doesn't fit your clinical picture at all. Let me show you why. She spread the EEG printouts across her desk, pointing to specific sections. First, your seizure patterns are completely consistent with temporal lobe epilepsy. They occur at regular intervals that correlate with your medication timing, not with emotional stress. Second, your response to anti-seizure medication has been textbook for neurological epilepsy. PNES doesn't respond to neurological medications the way your condition has. Dr. Martinez pulled out another document, a detailed timeline she had apparently prepared. Third, I went back through your medical records from the past 8 years. Your seizure frequency, intensity, and characteristics have remained remarkably consistent. If you had comorbid PNES, we would see much more variability in your symptoms, especially during periods of high stress. She leaned forward, her voice taking on a tone I'd never heard from her before, protective, almost fierce. Maya, someone has been systematically undermining your medical care by introducing doubt about a well-established diagnosis. That's not medical advocacy. That's psychological abuse. The words hit me like a physical blow. Psychological abuse? What I'm about to tell you might be difficult to hear, but I think you need to understand what's been happening to you. There's a term in medical literature called medical gaslighting, and it usually refers to healthcare providers dismissing patient symptoms. But it can also happen when someone without medical expertise uses their perceived authority to make a patient doubt their own medical reality. She handed me a research paper titled Family Dynamics in Chronic Medical Conditions, When Support Becomes Sabotage. This study examined cases where family members, often those with some medical background, created confusion about legitimate medical diagnoses. The psychological impact on patients is significant. Increased anxiety, depression, and ironically, worsening of their actual medical symptoms. As I read through the abstract, pieces began falling into place. The study described patients who experienced increased seizure frequency, medication noncompliance, and deteriorating family relationships when their medical conditions became the subject of ongoing family debate and analysis.
Dr. Martinez, are you saying that Stephanie has been deliberately trying to undermine my diagnosis? I'm saying that whether her intentions are deliberate or not, the effect has been to create ongoing uncertainty about a condition that should be straightforward to manage. Maya, you have temporal lobe epilepsy. It's well controlled with medication, your prognosis is excellent, and there is absolutely no evidence of any psychological component to your seizures. She pulled out one final document, a letter on official hospital letterhead. I'm writing a formal statement for your family that explains your diagnosis, the definitive nature of your test results, and my professional recommendation that discussions about alternative explanations for your seizures stop immediately. This is not a request, it's a medical directive. For the first time in months, I felt tears of relief rather than frustration. Dr. Martinez, my family thinks Stephanie is just trying to help me get the best possible care.
Maya, comprehensive medical care means consulting with specialists who have expertise in relevant fields. Your sister-in-law is a pediatric nurse practitioner. She has no training in adult neurology, no experience with epilepsy management, and no business conducting ongoing analysis of your medical condition. Her research is cherry-picking studies to support predetermined conclusions. Dr. Martinez's frank assessment was both validating and terrifying. On one hand, I finally had a medical professional who could see what had been happening to me. On the other hand, I was facing the reality that someone in my family had been systematically undermining my medical care for months. What do I do now? I asked. First, you follow my treatment plan without interference from family members who aren't qualified to modify it. Second, you establish clear boundaries about who gets to have input on your medical decisions. Third, you consider whether you need support in managing the psychological impact of what you've been through. She handed me a business card for Dr. Amanda Chen, a psychologist who specialized in medical trauma and family dynamics. This isn't because I think there's anything psychologically wrong with your seizures. It's because having your medical reality questioned for months is genuinely traumatic, and you deserve support in processing that experience. The appointment ended with Dr. Martinez scheduling my next follow-up and providing me with all my test results, her formal statement, and specific instructions for my family about appropriate support for my condition. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt like I had an ally who understood both the medical and psychological aspects of what had been happening to me. The drive home gave me time to process what Dr. Martinez had said about psychological abuse and medical gaslighting. I realized that my confusion and self-doubt hadn't been irrational responses to conflicting medical information. They had been normal reactions to a coordinated campaign to make me question my own reality. But understanding what had happened was only the first step. I still needed to figure out how to protect myself from future manipulation and how to rebuild relationships with family members who had unknowingly participated in undermining my medical care. That evening, I called Jennifer to update her on the appointment. Her response was immediate and clear. Maya, you need to stop trying to convince your family that Stephanie is wrong and start focusing on protecting yourself from her interference. What do you mean? I mean, you've been playing defense for months, trying to prove your condition is real, trying to counter her research, trying to get your family to see her manipulation. But you don't need to prove anything to anyone. You have a medical diagnosis from a qualified specialist. Your job now is to manage your health according to your doctor's recommendations, not to win a debate with someone who refuses to accept medical facts. Jennifer's perspective was liberating. I had been so focused on getting my family to understand Stephanie's manipulation that I had lost sight of my own autonomy and agency. I didn't need my family's permission to trust my doctor or follow my treatment plan. That night, I made a series of decisions that felt like reclaiming my own life. I would share Dr. Martinez's letter with my family, but I wouldn't debate its contents or defend its conclusions. I would attend family gatherings, but I would leave immediately if anyone began analyzing my medical condition. I would maintain relationships with family members who could respect my boundaries,
and I would limit contact with those who couldn't. Most importantly, I would stop trying to convince Stephanie that she was wrong and start treating her opinions about my medical care as irrelevant. The next morning, I sent a group text to my family. I'm sharing Dr. Martinez's statement about my condition. Moving forward, I won't be discussing my medical care at family gatherings. I love you all and want to focus on enjoying our time together rather than analyzing my health. I attached Dr. Martinez's letter and turned off my phone. The responses came throughout the day. My parents expressing support and apology, Marcus asking to talk privately, and Stephanie requesting a family meeting to discuss next steps. I responded only to my parents, thanking them for their support, and to Marcus, agreeing to meet for coffee later in the week. I ignored Stephanie's request entirely. For the first time in months, I felt like I was taking control of my own narrative, rather than constantly defending myself against someone else's version of my reality. The breakthrough wasn't just medical. It was psychological, emotional, and relational. I was done being a patient in my own family. I was ready to be the author of my own story.
6 months later, I stood in my parents' backyard watching my 5-year-old nephew Tommy chase bubbles while the rest of my family gathered for what had become our new normal, a relaxed Sunday barbecue without medical consultations, research presentations, or analysis of my health condition. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy, but it had been profound. The changes began within days of my decision to stop defending my medical reality and start protecting it instead. Marcus and I had our coffee conversation the week after I shared Dr. Martinez's letter, and it became the foundation for rebuilding our relationship on healthier terms. Maya, I need to apologize not just for doubting you, but for not seeing what was happening, he said, stirring his latte nervously. I read Dr. Martinez's letter and I did some research on medical gaslighting. I think I understand now that Stephanie wasn't helping. She was creating problems where none existed. Marcus, what changed? Why can you see it now when you couldn't before? He was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, I talked to some colleagues who work in healthcare about the whole situation. When I described what had been happening, they were horrified. One of them asked me a question that really stuck. If your sister had diabetes and someone kept suggesting her blood sugar episodes were psychological, would you think that was appropriate? It made me realize how absurd this whole thing had become. What does that mean for your marriage? I asked gently. It means Stephanie and I are in couples counseling. Because this pattern isn't just about you, Maya. I've started noticing how she positions herself as an expert on topics where she doesn't actually have expertise. It's affecting other areas of our relationship too. That conversation was the beginning of Marcus's journey to understand how he had been manipulated along with the rest of us. It wasn't easy for him to acknowledge that his wife had used her medical credentials to create family chaos, but he committed to the work of rebuilding trust with me while addressing the issues in his marriage. My parents' transformation was equally significant, but followed a different path. The turning point came when my mom attended one of my follow-up appointments with Dr. Martinez at my invitation. Hearing a medical professional explain the psychological impact of medical gaslighting opened her eyes to the damage that had been done. Dr. Martinez, we thought we were being supportive by listening to all perspectives on Maya's condition, my mom said during that appointment. How did we get it so wrong? Mrs. Rodriguez, medical gaslighting is particularly effective because it exploits people's desire to be thorough and open-minded. But there's a difference between getting a second medical opinion from a qualified specialist and allowing someone without relevant expertise to create ongoing doubt about an established diagnosis. After that appointment, my mom became one of my fiercest advocates. She researched medical gaslighting extensively, not to question my diagnosis, but to understand how families could protect themselves from similar manipulation in the future. She even attended a support group for families affected by medical trauma, where she learned strategies for providing genuine support without undermining patients' autonomy. My dad's response was characteristically direct. Maya, I failed to protect you from someone who was hurting you, and I'm sorry, he said during one of our regular phone calls. From now on, anyone who wants to discuss your medical condition with our family needs to go through you first. No exceptions. The most dramatic change involved Stephanie herself. Initially, she responded to my new boundaries with increased research efforts, sending me articles about family therapy approaches to chronic illness and requesting meetings to clear the air about our communication. When I didn't respond to these overtures, she escalated to expressing concern to other family members about my closed-mindedness regarding comprehensive care. The breaking point came during a family birthday party for my cousin's daughter. Stephanie cornered me in the kitchen and launched into what she clearly intended to be a reconciliation conversation. Maya, I feel like there's been a misunderstanding about my intentions. I've only ever wanted to help you get the best possible care. Maybe we could start fresh and work together on managing your condition. Stephanie, I appreciate that you believe your intentions were good, but I'm not interested in working together on my medical care. I have a neurologist who manages my condition, and that arrangement is working well for me. But surely you can see the value in having multiple perspectives, especially from someone with medical training? What I see is that your involvement in my medical care has been harmful to both my health and my relationships with my family. I'm asking you to stop researching my condition, stop sharing articles about it, and stop offering medical advice about it. Her response revealed the true nature of her motivations. Maya, I think you're being defensive and closed-minded. Medical conditions affect entire families, and families should work together to find the best solutions. Stephanie, my medical condition affects me. My family's role is to provide emotional support, not medical management. And right now, the most supportive thing you can do is respect my boundaries.
She left the party early that day, and our interactions since then have been cordial but minimal. Marcus later told me that she had been furious about my lack of gratitude for her research efforts, which confirmed my suspicion that her involvement had been more about establishing herself as an authority than about helping me. The most unexpected transformation came from my extended family. Once the immediate drama subsided, several relatives reached out to share their own experiences with medical gaslighting, or family members who had undermined their credibility in various ways. My cousin Lisa became a regular source of support, and my Aunt Patricia apologized for initially praising Stephanie's thoroughness without recognizing its harmful impact. Maya, what you went through made me think about other situations where someone in our family has been the designated expert on topics they don't actually understand, Patricia said during a phone conversation. It's made me more aware of how we sometimes confuse credentials with wisdom. Perhaps most importantly, my relationship with my own body and medical care was completely transformed. Working with Dr. Amanda Chen, the psychologist Dr. Martinez had recommended, helped me understand the psychological impact of months of medical gaslighting. Dr. Chen helped me develop strategies for trusting my own experience, advocating for myself in medical settings, and maintaining boundaries with people who tried to interfere with my healthcare decisions. Maya, one of the most insidious effects of medical gaslighting is that it can make patients doubt their ability to understand their own bodies, Dr. Chen explained during one of our sessions. Rebuilding that trust is crucial not just for your current condition, but for your future healthcare experiences. The work with Dr. Chen also helped me understand that my experience wasn't unique. Medical gaslighting, particularly when it comes from family members, affects many people with chronic conditions. Through support groups and online communities, I connected with others who had faced similar challenges and learned strategies for maintaining family relationships while protecting medical autonomy. My epilepsy management became remarkably straightforward once the family interference stopped. Dr. Martinez adjusted my medications slightly based on my improved stress levels, and my seizure frequency decreased to its lowest point since my initial diagnosis. More importantly, I regained confidence in my ability to recognize my symptoms, follow my treatment plan, and communicate effectively with my healthcare team. 6 months after setting boundaries with my family, I received an unexpected validation. Dr. Martinez asked if I would be willing to participate in a case study she was developing about medical gaslighting in family settings. The case study would be published in a neurology journal and used to help other healthcare providers recognize and address similar situations. Maya, your experience highlights how medical gaslighting can persist even after definitive diagnostic testing, she explained during one of our sessions. By sharing your story, you could help other patients and families avoid similar situations. Today, as I watch my family enjoy a peaceful Sunday together,
I realized that the journey through medical gaslighting taught me lessons that extended far beyond healthcare. I learned that setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's essential for maintaining healthy relationships. I learned that credentials don't automatically confer expertise and that genuine support looks very different from attempted control. Most importantly, I learned that my own experience and judgment are valid, even when others question them. The EEG results proved that my seizures were real, but the real victory was learning to trust myself regardless of external validation. My epilepsy is now just one aspect of my life, managed effectively with medication and regular medical care. It no longer defines my identity or dominates family conversations. My relationships with my parents and Marcus are stronger than they were before this ordeal, built on clearer communication and mutual respect for boundaries in healthcare decisions. My nephew Tommy catches a particularly large bubble and squeals with delight, running to show my dad his success. Watching this simple moment of joy, I'm grateful for the hard-won peace that allows us to focus on what really matters, loving each other without trying to control each other. The truth about my seizures was never really in question. The EEG confirmed what I had always known. But the truth about family, boundaries, and self-advocacy took much longer to understand. Those lessons, as painful as they were to learn, have made me stronger, healthier, and more capable of protecting not just my medical care, but my overall well-being. Sometimes the most important battles aren't the ones you fight to prove you're right, they're the ones you fight to preserve your right to be believed.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.